The Boeing 747 soared through a clear night sky, its engines humming softly. Inside the dimly lit cabin, passengers dozed, heads resting against windows, bodies wrapped in thin airline blankets. A baby fussed somewhere near the back, while a businessman typed away on his laptop, the glow from his screen illuminating his tired face. Captain Adrian Cole sat in the cockpit, monitoring the radar. It was a routine red-eye flight, until the storm hit. The sky darkened in an instant, clouds twisting and roiling like something alive. The wind howled, rattling the fuselage. Suddenly, the instruments failed. "Tower, this is Flight 418. We've lost all navigation. Requesting emergency." Adrian's voice was cut off by a deafening screech. He yanked the controls, trying to steady the plane, but the engines choked and died. Panic erupted in the cabin. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Through the cockpit window, Adrian saw it. An island, massive and shrouded in mist, appearing from nowhere. A voice, deep and ancient, whispered through the static, "You are expected." Then, impact. "Brace for impact!" Adrian shouted through the intercom, his voice strained over the wailing alarms. The emergency lights pulsed in an angry red rhythm, casting eerie shadows over the terrified passengers. The plane's nose sliced through the last veil of thin clouds, revealing the island rushing up like an open palm, ready to seize the falling jet. The Boeing 747 convulsed as if in its death throes. Screams rang through the cabin, but Adrian barely registered them, his mind momentarily thrown back to his final tour in Iraq, a roadside explosion, fire, the cries of his squad mates. He blinked hard, forcing the memory back into its mental grave. This wasn't the battlefield. This was now. And he still had a plane to land. His co-pilot, Ethan Walker, struggled with the failing radio, cursing under his breath as turbulence slammed him against his seatbelt. Below them, golden sands stretched toward the horizon, indifferent to their impending fate. Adrian exhaled sharply. Stiffening up during impact would mean broken bones, or worse. He relaxed his muscles just as he turned to warn Ethan, but the plane struck land before the words could leave his lips. The impact was a symphony of devastation. The fuselage screamed as metal sheared apart, wings snapping clean off like brittle twigs. The aircraft's carcass plowed a fiery path across the beach, hurling debris and bodies into the night. Flames bloomed in the wreckage's wake, their glow reflecting in the glassy, terrified eyes of the survivors. Somewhere beyond the roaring inferno, a flock of birds erupted from the treetops, startled into flight. "Get up, soldier! We're moving!" Adrian's eyes snapped open at the phantom voice of his former sergeant. His lungs burned as he gulped in air, his heart pounding like a war drum. Dazed, he reached for his restraints, fumbling with the buckle until, click, he was free. "Shit! We're still here." His neck ached as he turned toward Ethan. The younger man slumped over the shattered controls, his uniform stained with blood that no longer flowed. A jagged metal shard had impaled him clean through the chest, his vacant eyes staring into nothing. Adrian swallowed hard. His thoughts flickered to Ethan's wife, pregnant, waiting for him to come home. She would never hear his laugh again, never feel his touch. With a shaking hand, Adrian reached over and gently closed his friend's eyes. "I'm sorry, brother," he whispered, the small silver dog tag around his neck feeling heavier than ever. Drawing a deep breath, he pushed himself upright and moved toward the cockpit door. The cabin was a cathedral of destruction. Oxygen masks dangled like limp vines from overhead compartments, their plastic mouths frozen in silent screams. Luggage lay scattered among the seats, some torn open, spilling their contents like disemboweled corpses. And the bodies, so many bodies. Most still sat buckled in their seats, their heads lolling at unnatural angles. Some bore expressions of surprise, their final thoughts cut short. Others, the lucky ones, looked almost peaceful. Adrian's stomach lurched, but he bit back the bile rising in his throat. He had seen death before, too much of it. One row caught his eye, a father, his arms wrapped protectively around his young son. The boy's Boston Red Sox cap was askew, his small face hidden in his father's embrace. Adrian reached out, gently adjusting the cap. "Rest easy, kid," he murmured, forcing down the lump in his throat. Then he turned and stepped into the moonlight. The island stretched before him, bathed in an eerie silver glow. The ocean whispered against the rocks, waves licking the shore with an almost mocking gentleness. Scattered across the sand lay the plane's remains, jagged metal, shattered glass, suitcases flung open like discarded memories. Fires dotted the beach, flickering warnings in the darkness. Adrian squeezed his eyes shut. This has to be a nightmare. Any second now, he'd wake up in his apartment, drenched in sweat, the distant hum of city traffic lulling him back to reality. But when he opened his eyes, reality remained unchanged. No such luck, I'm afraid, a voice called from the shadows. Adrian turned toward the speaker, blinking against the glow of the nearest fire. The man emerged from the wreckage like a mirage, tall and dressed far too well for someone who had just survived a plane crash. His dark suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, but otherwise he looked as he had just left a business meeting. "My name is Lucien Moreau," the man said in a thick French accent, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt. "And if you are hoping this is all a bad dream, well, I'm sorry to disappoint." Adrian's gaze swept over the sand, catching sight of several sets of footprints leading away from the wreckage. "How many made it?" he asked, his voice hollow. Lucien's expression darkened. He hesitated before answering. "Just 4 of us." Adrian's chest tightened. 4 out of 113 lives. A fresh weight settled on his shoulders. He had witnessed loss before, on the battlefield, at the graves of friends, at his father's bedside in his final moments. But this was different. A voice from his past echoed in his mind, a ghostly whisper. Adrian clenched his fists, shaking off the memory. He turned back to the wreckage. "I need to check the emergency supplies." Lucien exhaled, shaking his head. "We already salvaged what we could." Adrian didn't respond. He wasn't just looking for provisions. He needed to see for himself. Stepping over a fallen passenger, he made his way back into the cockpit. The control panels flickered weakly, a few last sparks of life in a fading machine. He pressed a button on the emergency locator beacon. Nothing. The screen dimmed. The soft beep faded into silence. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." Adrian pressed at the radio buttons, but the only response was static. He checked his wristwatch. Dead. His phone, unresponsive. His jaw clenched as he tapped the screen in frustration. Perfect. Just perfect. No way to communicate. No way to signal for help. Taking a deep breath, he turned his attention to the captain's locker. He entered the 5-digit passcode, and after a satisfying click, the door swung open. Inside, nestled among emergency supplies, was something more reassuring than food or water. His old service-issued sidearm. Adrian tucked it into the back of his waistband. For the first time since the crash, he felt a semblance of control. Moments later, Lucien led Adrian to where the survivors had gathered under the shade of a massive palm tree. Adrian immediately took note of one of them, a pale, wiry man who introduced himself simply as Gray. Something about him set off alarms. Maybe it was the nervous glint in his eyes. Maybe it was the way his fingers toyed with a smooth stone, rolling it over his knuckles like a poker chip. Or maybe it was the unsettling inked symbol across his throat, staring at Adrian like a silent challenge. Adrian extended a hand, but Gray only smirked. Moving past the tension, Adrian turned to the second survivor, a heavy-set woman with jet black hair streaked with purple. She sat with arms crossed, her chin resting on her chest. "I'm Adrian," he said, offering his hand. She hesitated before giving it a weak shake. "Mel." Sweat dripped from Adrian's temple. He wiped it away. "Nice to meet you, Mel. Try to relax. We'll be all right." Gray snorted. "Why do you military types always say that? Everything's gonna be okay." He mimicked the words in a mocking tone. "We both know that's complete nonsense." Adrian's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Because people don't respond well to a, 'we're all stranded with little chance of survival,'" Gray scoffed, shaking his head. Lucien stepped beside Adrian. "He's right. We need to focus on survival. Captain, when can we expect a rescue?" Adrian sighed. "Hard to say. Normally, when a plane vanishes from the ATC grid, a search operation is launched immediately, and reconnaissance aircraft are dispatched over the last known location." Gray rolled his eyes. "So they'll see the wreckage and come get us. What's the problem?" Adrian hesitated. "The problem is, I don't think they'll have any idea where to look." Gray paused mid-motion, the stone stilling between his fingers. "What?" Lucien frowned. "What do you mean?" Adrian exhaled through his nose. "Because this island isn't supposed to be here." Gray barked out a sharp laugh. "Right. An entire island just magically appears out of nowhere? Sure. Makes total sense." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I've flown this route 1,000 times. I know the maps. And I swear to you, this island wasn't here before. A harsh cackle echoed from the jungle, some kind of bird or something else. Gray chuckled darkly, mimicking the sound. Well, Professor, if we're on some kind of phantom island, then what's the plan now? Adrian met his gaze. No point sugarcoating it. I don't know, he admitted. And the radio's down. So is our locator beacon. Sand flew as Gray shot to his feet. Wait. You're telling me we're stuck on an uncharted island with no way to call for help? Gray kicked over a stack of water bottles, sending them tumbling. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Lucien stepped forward, attempting to calm him. Please, we must. Gray shoved Lucien's hand away. His eyes locked onto Adrian, fists clenched. Well, Captain, since it's your damn fault we're here, what's the plan? A voice whispered in Adrian's mind. Lawson, screaming, fire. He forced the memory back down. Not now. We'll figure something out, Adrian said evenly. Lucien nodded. Yes, we will. We just have to. An arrow tore through the air and struck Lucien. His words died in a wet gurgle as crimson misted into the air. Gray staggered back, his pale face now streaked in red. Lucien sank to his knees, clutching his throat, eyes bulging in shock. He turned to Adrian as if expecting an explanation. Before Adrian could react, a second arrow struck, and Lucien collapsed forward, motionless in the sand. Adrian's weapon was out in a flash, safety off, sights trained on the jungle. Move, now! Where did that come from? Gray screamed. He pointed at the weapon. Wait, you had that this whole damn time? Run, Adrian bellowed. An arrow whistled past his cheek, missing by inches. He dropped into a crouch and fired twice into the jungle. The leaves rustled, but no screams followed. Mel scrambled to her feet, her sandals slipping against the sand. She nearly stumbled over Lucien's unmoving form, flailing as she tried to regain her balance. She reached for Gray, but he shoved her aside. Gray didn't hesitate. The moment Melody fell, something sharp grazed her calf, sending a jolt of pain up her leg. She collapsed with a cry. You coward! She screamed after him. She tried to crawl forward, her fingers digging into the sand. Another projectile struck the ground inches from... Help me! Gray didn't even glance back. He dove behind a chunk of debris, breathing hard. Another object whizzed past, lodging itself into the twisted metal beside him. He peeked out, eyes frantic, scanning the tree line. Then he saw Melody, struggling on the sand, and he smirked. Tough break, he called out. Looks like it's all about survival, sweetheart. And you? He shook his head. You're not exactly in peak condition. And with that, he bolted for the wreckage. The shattered remains of the plane loomed ahead, its metal frame flickering with firelight. Gray sprinted toward a jagged opening in the fuselage, but the second his foot crossed the threshold, a sudden force surged through him. His body tensed, muscles locking up as if he'd touched a live wire. A strangled cry tore from his throat as he was hurled backward, crashing onto the sand. Steam curled from his chest. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Adrian ignored Gray. He had bigger concerns. He reached down and pulled Melody up, steadying her. Her body trembled, cold sweat clinging to her skin. She kept glancing toward the jungle, eyes darting, searching for another threat. Adrian cupped her chin, forcing her to focus. I've got you, he said, but we need to move. Now, I need your help, okay? She swallowed hard, then nodded weakly. Adrian gave her a small nod in return before turning toward the trees. We're making a run for that gap in the jungle. Looks like a path. Melody nodded again, but her gaze lingered on Gray's twitching form. Adrian didn't wait. He took a deep breath. On two, he said. One. A projectile sliced through his sleeve. A sharp sting flared under his arm as a thin cut opened against his ribs. Go now! Melody limped forward, wincing with every step. Adrian spun toward the trees, spotting movement in the dense foliage. He acted fast, reacting on instinct. The jungle went silent. For a second, everything froze, as if whatever was lurking had momentarily paused. Adrian didn't stop to think. He ran. By the time he reached Gray, the man was already stirring, groaning. Adrian hesitated for a half second. Then he grabbed Gray's collar and hauled him up. I'll probably regret this, he muttered. But I've lost enough people today. Gray staggered to his feet, still dazed. Adrian shoved him forward. Move. They caught up with Melody 100 yards from the beach. She was crouched behind a palm tree, panting heavily. Her nails had been chewed down, black eyeliner streaking her face. When she saw Gray, she glared. Coward. Gray smirked. Yeah, you've mentioned that. Both of you. Shut it. Adrian's voice was low but firm. If we want to get out of this, you need to stay quiet. Gray scoffed. Easy for you to say, Captain Tough Guy. You're the one with the weapon. Adrian ignored him, eyes scanning the tree line. No movement. No more projectiles. But something felt off. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves. It was like the island itself was holding its breath. Adrian slowly lowered the weapon. I think we're okay, he murmured. Melody raised a shaking hand. I've got an injury here. Definitely not okay. Adrian crouched beside her, inspecting the wound. He had seen plenty of injuries before, from accidents to battlefield wounds. And this was bad. It wasn't just the cut, it was the thin, dark lines creeping outward from it. Some kind of toxin. Adrian forced a small smile. You'll be back on your feet in no time. She stared at him, unconvinced. This is going to hurt, he warned. Melody bit her lip. Just do it. Adrian didn't hesitate. He snapped the shaft of the object and pulled it free. Melody let out a sharp gasp, but didn't scream. Adrian quickly tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped it tightly around her leg. You did fine, he said, securing the knot. Last time I did this, the guy wouldn't stop whining. Gray clutched his chest in mock sympathy. Touching. Then his smirk faded. But seriously, what the hell are we supposed to do? Adrian glanced at the tree line. First, we need to get out of sight. Not just that, Gray said, rubbing his chest where the invisible force had struck him. Something hit me hard when I tried to get into the plane. Melody's eyes narrowed. You mean when you ran off and left me to fend for myself? Gray just grinned. Perspective. Adrian ignored them both. He didn't know what was happening on this island, but he knew one thing for sure. They were running out of time. The jungle hummed with something just out of reach. Adrian rubbed his throat. It was dry. Then he heard it, the distant rush of water. He exhaled. We need water, he said. If we're going to last long enough to figure a way off this island, we need fresh water. Gray scowled. Yeah? And if whatever's after us is waiting in the jungle? Adrian didn't look at him. He tightened his grip on the weapon. Then we keep moving. Melody stumbled. Adrian barely caught her before she collapsed, his arm hooking under hers just in time. Her bandage was completely soaked, dark streaks of blood trailing down her calf. A slow trickle of thick fluid oozed from the wound. I don't, she panted, swaying unsteadily. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. Adrian glanced ahead. Through the dense foliage, moonlight shimmered on a secluded lagoon. A thin waterfall cascaded down into it, glistening silver against the darkness. There, Adrian said, nodding toward the water. We'll get you cleaned up and take a break. Before they could move, Gray sprinted past them without a word. He dropped to his knees at the water's edge, scooping frantic handfuls of water into his mouth, splashing it over his face. Adrian helped Melody down onto the soft sand, but his focus remained on the jungle. Something wasn't right. That creeping unease slithered over his skin, like an unseen force pressing against his back. You shouldn't have rushed in like that, Adrian muttered, scanning the tree line. Could have been a trap waiting. Gray grinned, flicking water from his fingertips. Yeah? Well, at this point, what else could possibly go wrong? Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he knelt and carefully peeled away Melody's bandage. Don't look, he warned. She clenched her jaw and turned away. Beneath the cloth, her leg was swollen and dark, the veins around the wound webbing out in an unhealthy purplish hue. Adrian bit back a curse. The infection was spreading. A deep, guttural bellow shattered the silence. The trees trembled. Adrian's head snapped up, his grip tightening on his pistol. Gray froze mid-motion, water dripping from his chin. What was that? The jungle erupted. Figures pushed through the foliage, stepping into the moonlight. They were human, but just barely. Powerful bodies, clad in worn animal hides, moved with eerie precision. Their scarred, marked skin glistened under the night sky. Primitive bows and spears bristled in their hands, and their faces, or lack thereof. Where eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets, sunken pits of leathery flesh. Melody gasped in horror. A massive figure strode to the front, towering over the others. His left arm ended in a rugged stump, but instead of a hand, something else had been affixed to the wound, a 3-foot length of curved bone, its serrated edges gleaming in the moonlight. Gray took a trembling step back, pointing with a shaking finger at the monstrous leader. Okay, I'm just gonna say it again. What is that? Adrian didn't hesitate. He grabbed Melody and pulled her to her feet. Move! The lagoon shimmered under the moonlight, its surface reflecting the sky like polished glass. But beyond it, a cave entrance loomed at the base of the cliffside, a dark, gaping maw leading into the unknown. "We need to get inside," Adrian called, dragging Melody toward the entrance. Gray hesitated, staring into the cave's inky darkness. "You want to go in there?" he snapped. "Are you serious?" A chorus of wild cries erupted behind them. The pursuers were closing in. Either the cave, Adrian barked, or them. Gray made his choice. "To hell with you two. I'm going in," he muttered, shoving past Adrian and disappearing into the shadows. Adrian tightened his grip on his weapon, jaw clenched. Melody glanced at him, trying to smile despite the fear in her eyes. "I'm used to it," she whispered. "People like me. They always run first." Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he gritted his teeth and pulled her forward. The jungle trembled as their pursuers closed in. The cave entrance yawned open before them, its jagged stone edges resembling the teeth of an ancient creature. Adrian stepped inside first, his weapon raised, scanning the passage. Moonlight stretched only a few feet into the tunnel before it was swallowed by absolute darkness. Ahead, Gray's voice echoed from around a bend. Guys? You're gonna want to see this." Adrian led Melody forward, his heart pounding. The tunnel opened up, and his breath caught in his throat. The cavern was massive, easily the size of a stadium, its ceiling arched high overhead, crisscrossed by thin beams of silver moonlight. But what left them speechless wasn't the size of the space. It was the structure that dominated it, a pyramid, towering, ancient, impossibly well-preserved. Its obsidian surface shimmered in the dim light. A long rope bridge stretched across a deep chasm, leading to the steep steps that climbed to its entrance. Adrian's mind raced. A temple? A ruin? How was this even here? Melody exhaled sharply. "You've got to be kidding me?" For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Adrian took a step forward. "We need to keep moving." Gray scoffed. "Yeah? And you're just gonna cross this rickety bridge and waltz into the Temple of Doom over there? Are you out of your mind?" Adrian ignored him. Standing still wasn't an option. "Look," he said, "you can stay here and make friends with the locals." A war cry shattered the silence. Their pursuers had entered the cave. Adrian turned to Gray, voice cold and sharp. "Or you can move. Now." Gray didn't argue. He moved. The cries grew louder. Their footsteps echoed against the stone, fast and relentless. No more time. Adrian tested the first plank of the bridge with his foot. The wood groaned but held. He turned to Gray. "You go first." Gray snapped his head up, instantly protesting. "What? Why me?" Adrian's gaze was like steel. Gray took one look at it and shut up. "Fine," he muttered, stepping forward. He grabbed the rope railing and took a cautious step onto the bridge. The wood creaked beneath him. He swallowed hard and took another step, then another. A slow, nervous grin crept across his face. "See ya on the other side." Adrian turned back to guard the entrance. A long shadow stretched across the cavern floor. He steadied his breathing and aimed. A sharp noise echoed through the confined space, sending a burst of sparks off the passage wall. The figure halted. Low murmurs drifted from around the bend, whispers in a language Adrian didn't recognize. He glanced over his shoulder. Melody clung to the bridge's rope railing, her knuckles turning white as she took a trembling step forward. Adrian gave her a firm nod. "Go. Now." She hesitated before shuffling forward onto the bridge. Adrian backed up, keeping his focus on the entrance. Cold sweat trickled down his back. The pursuers were waiting, watching, not advancing yet. But they would. Soon. Gray reached the other side, stumbling onto solid ground. He collapsed onto his knees, inhaling deep, frantic breaths. He turned back, waving his arms. "Hurry! The bridge isn't stable on this side." A long hiss seeped from the cavern's entrance. Adrian's stomach tensed. Then came the sound of movement. Adrian sent another warning shot into the passageway. The pursuers hesitated, shifting in the shadows. Then another figure stepped into view. Mako. He loomed over the others, his mechanical arm gleaming in the dim light. His jaw seemed to stretch unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Then he let out a roar. The sound shook the air, raw and primal. Gray's voice cracked from the other side of the bridge. "Hey, I'm no expert, but maybe aim the next 7 or 8 shots at the big guy with the terrifying mouth." Adrian kept his focus. "Get Melody to the temple," he commanded. Gray hesitated, then summoning his courage, stepped onto the bridge. He moved toward Melody, reaching for her hand. Crack! A rotten plank gave way. Melody's foot plunged through the hole. She gasped, flailing as she fell through the splintered wood, her fingers barely grasped onto the lower rope. Now she dangled, 20 feet above the water. Adrian's heart pounded. Mel! A growl interrupted him. Mako's grin widened. Then he charged. Adrian sprinted across the bridge. His boots pounded against the swaying wood, the cavern spinning beneath him. He dropped into a low crouch, twisted, and fired. The impact staggered Mako, but he raised his arms, shielding his face. Adrian didn't stop. He lunged for Melody's wrist, his fingers locking around her arm. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Please," she whimpered. Adrian tightened his grip. He pulled. Inch by inch, he hauled her up, his muscles burning. Then he heard it, a sawing noise. He turned his head, and his stomach dropped. Gray was cutting the bridge. The serrated edge of a survival knife sliced through the thick anchor ropes with ease. Adrian's eyes widened. "No! What are you doing?" Gray didn't stop. His expression was distant, cold, as if he had already made peace with his decision. "Sorry, boss," he muttered. "Can't take any chances." Snap! One support rope snapped. The bridge lurched violently, tilting downward. Adrian's grip faltered. An arrow whistled past his head. On the other side, Gray let out a sharp cry. An arrow struck his shoulder. He stumbled, cursing, then turned and ran. His footsteps faded into the distance. Melody's lip quivered. "Please," she whispered again. Adrian's muscles trembled. The ropes groaned. He could feel the weight slipping. Her soft skin began to slide through his grip. And for the first time since the crash, Adrian realized he wasn't strong enough. "I'm sorry." Melody let out a piercing cry as she slipped from his grasp. She fell into the water below. The current pulled her under before Adrian could react. Mako let out a triumphant roar, raising his mechanical limb into the air. Adrian squeezed his eyes shut. For a moment, he considered letting go, letting himself fall, ending it here. But something inside him refused. He gritted his teeth and climbed. Adrian had seen loss before. He had watched people disappear, their last moments slipping away. But Melody was different. She hadn't signed up for danger. She hadn't stepped onto a battlefield knowing the risks. She had been a passenger on a flight home, and now she was gone. Something cold and sharp ignited in the back of Adrian's mind. A voice, small at first, grew louder, sharper, more demanding. Gray must answer for this. Arrows clattered against the cavern walls, some striking the edge of the promontory, sending sparks flying. Adrian ignored them. With a growl, he hauled himself up the final stretch of the bridge and stumbled onto solid ground. Behind him, Mako stood motionless at the halfway point of the bridge. He bore the marks of their battle, but he did not fall. He just watched. Adrian took one last look at him. "I'll be back for you later," he muttered. Then he turned and ran. The climb burned his legs and lungs. By the time he reached the top, his breath was ragged. The darkened entrance loomed before him, a 12-foot-high maw swallowing the light. A faint crackling sound came from within. Fire. Adrian stepped inside. The darkness was complete. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the smooth stone walls, guiding himself forward. The snap and pop of flames grew louder. A bend in the passageway. A flickering torch in a wall sconce. Adrian pulled it free, the firelight casting dancing shadows along the walls. Something nagged at his thoughts. Why would Gray leave a trail? Adrian swung the torch forward, the flame revealing the corridor ahead. The tunnel spiraled in a gentle incline, the air growing warmer, heavier. Something squeaked in the darkness. Rats. Adrian clenched his jaw. "Just don't let there be snakes," he muttered to himself. The corridor finally emptied into a massive chamber. A ring of burning braziers lined the walls, bathing the space in a shifting, amber glow. But it wasn't the size of the room that caught Adrian's breath. It was the columns. 4 massive stone pillars, each nearly 2 stories high, stood at the chamber's center. They were carved from a strange greenish rock, covered in crude, angular symbols. The carvings looked as though they had been made with primitive stone tools. At the base of each column sat a reflecting pool of perfectly still water. Adrian stepped closer, brow furrowed in wonder. The hair on his arms stood on end. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, a sharp cry shattered the silence. Adrian spun. Gray came rushing into the chamber from a passage on the opposite side, his face twisted in sheer panic. Adrian raised his fists, torch in one hand, ready to fight. "Come on, you coward," he muttered, but Gray never even looked at him. He bolted past Adrian, his eyes wide with pure terror. Then, with full momentum, he crashed face first into the stone wall. The sickening sound of impact echoed through the chamber. Gray's body crumpled, unmoving. Adrian stood still, breathing heavily. Something was wrong. He stepped forward, eyes locked on Gray's twitching fingers. Adrian crouched, pressing 2 fingers against the man's throat. No pulse. Adrian exhaled, then tilted Gray's head to the side. His stomach twisted at what he saw. Scarlet track marks laced across Gray's face, neck, and chest. Thin, raised veins, inflamed and bulging. It looked like something had been moving beneath his skin. "What happened to you?" Adrian muttered. He reached out, lightly touching one of the swollen veins. Something inside it shifted. Adrian jerked back. A swollen lump formed in the middle of Gray's forehead, pulsing as if it were alive. More of them slithered under the skin, how traveling downward. Adrian stepped back, hand tightening around the survival knife in Gray's grip. The man's fingers didn't loosen. "Come on, damn it." Another lump swelled and burst. Adrian grimaced and stomped on Gray's wrist. Once, twice. The third stomp forced his fingers open. Adrian snatched up the knife, then lunged for the dropped torch. Gray's body jerked. Adrian froze. Slowly, Gray sat up. His head lolled to the side, his jaw hanging slack, his skin rippling and shifting. A low groan escaped his lips. Adrian took a step back. "Nope," he muttered. "Not happening." Gray lurched forward. Adrian hurled the torch. Flames roared to life, consuming Gray's clothes, crawling up his arms. Gray let out an unnatural, piercing wail. Beneath his skin, something shrieked along with him. Adrian watched as Gray's form deteriorated, his body collapsing into a pile of charred remains. The fire flickered. A voice, calm, amused, broke the silence. "Impressive," Adrian spun. A man stood at the edge of the chamber. Dressed in a pristine suit, his dark complexion untouched by the grime of the island, he adjusted his bold red tie with casual ease. His smile revealed perfect, gleaming teeth. Adrian's blood ran cold. "I saw you fall," he whispered. The man grinned, his teeth too white, too perfect. He ran a single finger along the projectile still lodged in his throat. "Oh, this?" he asked, casually pulling it free. The wound sealed shut before Adrian's eyes. The man tucked the arrow into his pocket, adjusting his cuffs. "Not to worry," he said with a smirk. "I've had worse." Adrian took an instinctive step back, knife raised. The man tilted his head, almost amused. His voice dropped to a whisper. "And yet?" His faintly in the firelight. "Here we both are." Adrian kept his knife raised, his muscles tense. The man simply smiled. "I'll let you in on a little secret," he said, shielding his mouth with one hand, voice conspiratorial. "They've been bringing people here for years." Adrian's jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward the small of his back, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but his firearm was gone. The man smirked, watching him. "You know," he continued, "I've never actually met one of them in person. One of the others, that is." His eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. "They come in my dreams. They tell me when they hunger. They tell me which transport to board. And then, before I know it, boom. Here I am again." A single bead of sweat trickled down Adrian's temple. "The hunter's outside," Adrian said, voice low. "The one with the shark jaw for an arm. How could they have brought down a plane?" The man laughed. "Oh no, no, of course not. They're just the unfortunate souls who lived here when the others first arrived." His smile widened. "They can do things you couldn't dream of." Adrian's stomach tightened. "Like causing aircraft to fall from the sky?" The man shrugged. "And then you... What? Make sure any survivors find their way here?" Adrian spat. "Seems like a pretty reckless way to ensure someone arrives. What if no one survived the impact?" The man chuckled. "Ah, there it is. That military skepticism." He shook his head. "They're not after meat, Captain." Adrian frowned. "Not even after blood, despite all the legends about beings lurking in the shadows." The man wiggled his fingers as if telling a ghost story. Adrian stepped closer, his grip on the knife tightening. "What then?" The man's eyes sparkled. "You still don't get it?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "They don't feed on flesh, they feed on conflict." Adrian stiffened. "The drive for violence, the part of the human spirit that thrives in battle, the hunger for confrontation, the rage that builds just before a person makes their move." The man's grin grew sharper. "They drink it up like fine wine." Adrian's breath came in slow, steady draws. Across from him, Lucian tilted his head, a knowing smirk on his lips. "That fire inside you? That need to push forward, no matter the cost?" He tapped his own chest. "They can sense it." Adrian's fingers curled into fists. "How do you know all this?" Lucian exhaled, almost wistfully. Because I've been here far longer than you can imagine. He spread his arms wide, as if embracing the very air. They keep me here. I am their anchor, the one who draws challengers in. Adrian took another step forward, his knife catching the flickering torchlight. Lucian's smirk didn't fade. But there is always a price, he said, voice calm. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. And what price is that? Lucian's smile deepened. A battle for survival, Captain. Adrian lunged. Lucian simply stepped aside. Oh, I won't be fighting you, he said, motioning to the far side of the chamber. Something shifted in the darkness. Heavy footsteps echoed against the stone. A massive figure emerged from the shadows. Adrian felt his stomach tighten. Mako. The towering warrior stood, his powerful form still marked by previous battles, yet the wounds had long since faded, leaving only faint scars. Adrian exhaled. Yeah, figures. Lucian stepped back, gesturing to the open space between them. The rules are simple, Captain, he said with a pleasant air. You fight, one of you remains standing. The other, he shrugged, does not. His tone turned colder. And do not mistake this for mere combat. The Watchers are observing. A chill ran down Adrian's spine. If they sense you're holding back, Lucian leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. They will make you relive it. Adrian's breath hitched. The crash, the ruins, the pursuit. Melody's voice calling out in fear. He clenched his jaw. No, not again. His eyes locked onto Mako, now framed by towering, rune-carved columns. The jagged, shark-toothed blade in his grasp glistened under the firelight. Adrian steadied himself. He was smaller, weaker, slower. He had no firearm. He had only a knife and whatever strength remained. His only chance was to close the distance, to end this swiftly. Mako shifted, his movements deliberate. Then, with startling speed, he lunged, his weapon slashing through the air toward Adrian's throat. Adrian ducked, twisting away. The blade sliced inches from his skin. With a sharp breath, Adrian struck back, driving his knife toward the opening between Mako's ribs. The blade barely made a mark. Adrian's eyes widened. Impossible. Mako didn't even flinch. And then, he grinned. Adrian took a half step back. What are you? Lucian's voice carried through the chamber, as even as ever. He is the will of the Watchers made flesh. Adrian ignored him. He adjusted. This time he feinted left, then slashed upward, his blade carving through Mako's left eye. A guttural roar shook the temple walls. Mako staggered back, gripping his wounded face. Adrian forced a grin. So you do feel something. Mako's snarl was primal. Adrian moved, weaving past a sweeping strike, dodging a brutal downward swing. Then, he drove his knife deep into the back of Mako's knee. The warrior dropped to one side, a sharp breath escaping his lips. Adrian moved in for the final blow. Then, a sharp sensation tore across his stomach. Mako's blade had grazed him. Adrian stumbled back, gasping. His vision blurred. His breath turned ragged. Something was wrong. His chest felt tight, his arms felt heavy, his grip on the knife weakened. Adrian tried to steady himself, but the chamber tilted. The torches blurred into swirling halos of gold. His knees buckled. A whisper, soft and filled with sorrow, brushed against his ear. You left me. How could you? Adrian's breath caught. His body lurched, nearly toppling into the reflecting pool at the base of the stone column. No, his vision swam. His chest constricted. You're not here. You can't be here. He rubbed his eyes, willing the image away. But when he looked again, Lawson stood there. Or rather, a flickering shadow of him. His form was fragmented, like a mirage rippling in the air. His eyes, dark and knowing, held a deep sorrow. Lawson raised a hand. You swore you'd never leave me. Adrian's breath was uneven. This isn't real, he whispered. The memories surged back like a wave. Lawson's craft had gone down, lost in fire. Adrian had tried. He had fought to reach him, but by the time he got close, the wreckage was consumed. You let me go. Other voices rose behind Lawson, faint echoes from the past. The scent of smoke filled the chamber, thick and suffocating. Adrian's knees nearly gave out. His hands clamped over his ears, refusing to listen. You're not real. And then, silence. Lawson was gone. The echoes faded. Adrian stood alone. His breath came hard and fast, his heartbeat like a war drum in his chest. A heavy breath stirred the air behind him. Mako, the warrior, loomed over him, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. Adrian turned, instincts sharp, and without hesitation, he drove his survival knife upward, beneath the jaw. Mako let out a choked exhale. Dark liquid trickled from his lips as he staggered, his hands weakly grasping at the blade. Then, with one final, shuddering breath, he collapsed into the reflecting pool. The water rippled outward, streaks of darkness swirling beneath the firelight. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip of water and Adrian's ragged breathing. Then, a surge of emerald energy erupted from the heart of the four ancient columns. It crackled through the air, arcing like lightning, striking each pillar in sequence. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the chamber. "Impressive work, Captain." Adrian's gaze snapped toward the shifting shadows. Lucian emerged from the darkness, his movements slow and deliberate. It has been years, perhaps even longer, since a warrior of Mako's stature was overcome. You have earned the recognition and favor of the others. Adrian's fingers twitched against the hilt of his blade. "Rest assured, Captain," Lucian continued, his grin unwavering. "They will remain at rest for the foreseeable future." Adrian's stomach twisted. "And what exactly do you mean by foreseeable future?" Lucian chuckled, adjusting his cuffs with practiced ease. "Ah, my dear Captain, I promised that if you endured, you would continue on." His smile sharpened. "But I never said you would be free." Adrian's breath stilled. A creeping sense of dread coiled in his chest. This had never been about escape. His hands curled into fists, his fury simmering beneath the surface. "Then let's strike a new bargain," he growled. "Step forward, and we'll negotiate the hard way." Lucian smirked. "Ah, but I told you, Captain, I won't be engaging in any battles today." Then, a sudden agony ignited at Adrian's fingertips. A searing, unbearable heat surged up his arm, consuming his skin with an intensity that stole his breath. He cried out, his left arm beginning to break apart, not in flame, but in something unnatural, unraveling like embers drifting into the wind. He collapsed to his knees, gripping his disintegrating limb, pain fracturing his focus. His vision blurred, his pulse thundered in his ears. Footsteps approached from behind. A group of solemn figures entered the chamber. They moved without words, stepping around Adrian with quiet reverence, lifting Mako's motionless form from the water. Adrian could only watch, his mind fogged, as they carefully turned the warrior onto his back. One among them, a figure bearing a crude stone blade, stepped forward. With precise, practiced movements, they severed a piece of Mako's weaponized arm, separating the jagged remains. Then, without hesitation, they turned to Adrian. His breath caught. The figure lifted the severed fragment high, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then, slowly, they nodded. Adrian's pulse pounded in his ears. They were offering it to him. Two imposing figures grasped his shoulders, holding him in place. Adrian fought, struggled, shouted, but their grip was firm. The figure pressed the sharpened fragment to the remains of Adrian's arm, binding it to the raw surface. A new kind of pain, one beyond description, coursed through him, sharp and all-consuming. Adrian's vision wavered. Something inside him shifted. Then, something else stirred. A strange, creeping sensation replaced the agony, coiling within him like an ember catching flame. At first, he thought it was shock dulling the edges. He fought to hold on to his thoughts, his name, his purpose, his past, but they slipped through his grasp like grains of sand. His rage softened, his will blurred. His path changed. Adrian didn't even flinch as one of the figures raised a ceremonial blade before him. The last thing he saw was the edge, descending swiftly. The waves lapped against the shore, an endless rhythm against the sands of an island long steeped in mystery. Along the beach, the remains of Flight 418 lay scattered, charred metal, torn seats, luggage spilled open like forgotten echoes of another world. The fires had long since burned out, leaving only twisted wreckage beneath the silver moonlight. Near the dense jungle, figures stood in silence, their expressions unreadable, faces bearing the marks of those who had seen much. One among them stood taller, his form commanding. The weaponized limb now a part of him gleamed under the moonlight, the jagged edges glinting like a predator's grin. Adrian Cole was no more. Only Mako remained. The wind shifted, hate carrying the distant hum of engines. Adrian, Mako, lifted his gaze. The others followed, their focus sharpening as they turned toward the sky. On the horizon, blinking navigation lights drew closer. Another arrival, another test, another cycle set into motion. Mako's new lips curved into a knowing smile. "They're here,"